Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is gasp. Let's take a look at some of the definitions or ways that you might hear this verb used. The first way you might hear gasp used is to mean to inhale suddenly with an open mouth. Now, I can sort of demonstrate to help us understand this. It's the idea of that inhale suddenly. And many times people might be doing that because they are in pain, they are shocked, they are surprised at something else. A second way you might hear gasp used is to mean to say something while one is catching their breath. So, with this second definition, I can think of various stories, even sort of, I can kind of picture movies and TV shows, right, where someone is, right, really kind of inhaling and exhaling rapidly, and they're trying to talk or say something sort of important, maybe something that's very time sensitive. So, a related and third way you might hear gasp used is to mean to strain in order to take a deep breath. So here, it might be because someone is ill or they've been injured that they are struggling to take a breath. You should know that gasp is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, all we need to do is add ing to form gasping. The past tense and participle forms of this verb are made by adding ed. Our base verb, gasp, ends in an unvoiced p sound. So our past tense ending is going to make a t sound when we say it. It should sound like this: gasped, gasped. Okay. Sounds a little funny, can be a bit difficult to produce. But now let's take a moment to look at some phrasal verbs with gasp. You're going to see these sort of connect back to those earlier definitions we looked at. So the first one here is to gasp at. So here someone is making a sharp or sudden inhale, and again, they might be doing it out of surprise. An example of this: everyone gasped at the news of the community member's passing. Maybe you've had this experience where you learn some really surprising news and no, oh my gosh, right? That sharp inhale. That's what we're talking about with this verb. Another phrasal verb you might hear that ties back to our second definition here is to gasp out. So here we're saying something, right? We're trying to get it out while we're also sort of having this difficulty breathing, or as our breath is being quite labored. Okay, an example here: the injured person gasped out what happened with the driver that led to the accident. Okay, so perhaps someone was driving, they had some kind of medical emergency, and they cause a car accident, right? There might be someone else who watched this happen, but they're also injured. So they're trying to talk while also maybe sort of struggling to breathe as a result of their injuries. And that's what that particular sentence is describing. Now let's continue our practice with the verb gasp. Today we're going to focus on the simple present and the present perfect progressive, or you might know it as the present perfect continuous. They mean the same thing, but let's start with the simple present. We use this verb tense to describe habits or routines. So these are actions that repeat with some regularity. We also use it to describe facts. And the thing about the simple present is that we need to pay attention to our subject. If our subject is I, you, we, or they, we're just going to use the base verb. But if our subject is he, she, or it, we need to add an S to the end of the verb. And I want to point out the spelling GASPS. This can be a really difficult sound to produce. And so what happens with a lot of speakers is that the P sound gets sort of eliminated, or it might be really soft, and you just kind of hear this S sound being held. So let's take a look at an affirmative example and we'll see how clearly I produce this sound. So, she always gasps during scary movies. Okay? She always gasps during scary movies. So, as I'm saying that, you're probably not hearing a very strong P sound. And that's because it's difficult and I always like to point that out, not that I believe my students have to produce the word in that exact way, but I want them to be aware if they're listening to other people, this is how it might sound. Now let's take a look at the negative in the simple present. Again, we need to pay attention to our subject. If our subject is I, you, we, or they, our structure is going to be do, not, and then the base verb, or don't and the base verb. If our subject is he, she, or it, we're going to say does not and the base verb, or doesn't and the base verb. So notice in the negative here, I'm not adding S to the end of any of my verbs. Here's another example sentence. They don't gasp while watching magicians. Okay. Some people really enjoy magic, right? And they might have this shocked or surprised reaction as someone correctly guesses their card or locates something else that appears to have been destroyed. But for other people, they are not impressed that they might know there's some sort of trick to this, and so they don't have that shocked or surprised reaction. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the simple present. With this question, again, we need to pay attention to our subject. So we're going to start with do or does, and then the subject comes next. And we want to make sure our subject matches our form of do or does. Okay, so do or does, subject, and then our base verb. An example here, it's a longer question. Do people with the Omicron variant gasp as much as others who've had different COVID variants? Okay. So this question might tie back to that third definition, talking about someone who's really struggling to breathe to get air. And we know many people who have had COVID 19. Unfortunately, many have struggled and many have died because they've not been able to breathe regularly. But I should say I don't know the answer to this question. I saw it posed by someone who was wondering kind of what symptoms are like through different variants and how people are reacting. But I did think it was a nice way to tie back to the third definition of this verb. Now let's take a look at the present perfect progressive. We use this verb tense to talk about an action that started in the past and continues into the present. And I like calling this the present perfect progressive because it reminds me that I need three parts. There are three P's there. So I need three parts to make this verb tense. Again, I'm going to pay attention to my subject. If my subject is I, you, we, or they, then I'm going to use have, then the participle been, B-E-E-N, and then the ing form of the verb. But if my subject is he, she, or it, I'm going to use has, then been, and then the ing form of the verb. You can see that in my example. He has been gasping for air during this entire game. Right? So here's somebody really struggling to breathe. They're out of breath. Right? So maybe they've been running or working really hard. Perhaps we're describing an athlete here, but that athlete is really struggling to sort of breathe at a normal rate. Now, if I want to make a negative present perfect progressive sentence, again, I'm going to pay attention to my subject and then use have or has. Then I'll use not. You might also hear the contractions hasn't or haven't. And then we're going to use been, B-E-E-N, and then the ing form of the verb. Here's another example. The players on the other team haven't been gasping during this entire game. Okay, so here we're talking about someone who's not struggling to breathe or to get air. Finally, we can ask yes or no questions in the present perfect progressive. We'll do this by starting with have or has, whichever form matches our subject, and the subject comes next. Then we have our participle been, then the ing form of the verb. Here's another example. Has the patient been gasping for a long time? Right? So maybe this is a question. A doctor or nurse is asking a patient or the patient's family, or maybe a doctor's asking a nurse, who knows. But we're again kind of paying attention to how that person is getting air into their body. Now, let's spend just a couple minutes looking at some words and phrases related to our verb of the day, gasp. And the first word we're going to look at is just the noun form of this word. So, same spelling, same pronunciation. And when we use the noun gasp, we're referring to that action of suddenly inhaling. And again, maybe we're doing it to catch one's breath, or we might also be doing it out of shock or surprise. And I think you can see that in our example here. Gasps were heard as the new work of art was revealed, right? So maybe there's something really shocking or surprising about this particular painting or sculpture or whatever the work of art might be. The next phrase we're going to look at is the last gasp. Okay, so when this phrase gets used, many times a person is referring to sort of the end point of something. So the point of exhaustion could be the point of death, could be the point of completion. An example of this might be, are we nearing the last gasp of the war in Ukraine? I know a lot of people have been asking this question, kind of the idea here of like, is it going to end soon? So that's would tie back to that completion part of the definition. Another phrase you might hear is to gasp for air. And so again, we're describing that action, right, of sharp inhales, because perhaps someone has a medical condition that's making it difficult to breathe, or maybe there's been some sort of strenuous activity, right? They've been running, they've been swimming, they've been doing something that kind of makes it hard here. So an example of this: he gasped for air after swimming the length of the pool underwater. Okay, so some pools can be quite long, and imagine, right, someone holds their breath, swims underwater without taking any additional breaths, gets to the other side, right, and they're gonna go right, to try and get enough air back into their body. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.